Welcome to this presentation on the Vets2Vets African Swine Fever Workshop from the Center for Animal Health and Food Safety at the University of Minnesota College of Veterinary Medicine. My name is Dr. Rachel Shambo. I'm a veterinarian and researcher at CAFS, and together with CAFS Director, Dr. Andres Perez, and with the support of the National Pork Board, we're happy to share a summary of the lessons learned from this event. You can find the full written report via the link and QR code on the right of this slide, which is hosted on CAF's website. This link will be available throughout and at the end of the presentation as well. I'll start with a brief introduction to the Vets2Vets activity, and then talk more about what we did at the workshop and some lessons learned. At the end, there'll be an interest form that you can fill out if you'd like to participate in a future Vets2Vets activity or suggest ideas for future foreign animal disease educational opportunities. Vets2Vets is centered around the idea that there's a lot known about prevention and control of diseases by veterinarians and producers in affected countries, and that veterinarians can be great resources for each other. For ASF specifically, there's a lot of information and general guidelines that are available to US veterinarians about ASF control and preparedness, but those resources aren't always specific enough to be used when creating protocols for farms. A lot of that specific information is known to veterinarians that are facing the disease in affected countries, but is often potentially too sensitive to be shared openly. That might be due to regulatory issues, or that information just might be too new to be generally available yet. So the goal of our Vets2Vets program and workshop was to connect US swine veterinarians with international veterinarians that have extensive ASF field experience to share that practical field knowledge with them about ASF prevention and control. We wanted this to be an interactive learning activity and an opportunity for network building for US swine veterinarians. With the support and funding from the National Pork Board, we were able to put together our first Vets2Vets African Swine Fever Workshop, which was held September 16th, 2023. This was an interactive dinner workshop where the goal was to create a dialogue around ASF control, where participants would feel comfortable and safe sharing this potentially sensitive knowledge. Towards creating that safe environment, we did ask that participants complete a confidentiality agreement, just asking not to share the names of countries or individuals of that this knowledge may have come from, and really ultimately just to, again, encourage folks to talk really openly about what it is they actually do on their farms for ASF prevention and control. We were able to bring experts from 3 different ASF affected countries that we were able to identify through our existing CAFS networks and collaborations. These were veterinarians that had extensive field and farm experience creating protocols and facing ASF in these affected countries. We had 22 participants for our workshop, including 6 international experts, which again came from 3 different ASF affected countries, 6 moderators, which were team members of CAFS and collaborators from CAFS. For example, I was a moderator and Dr. Perez was a moderator, and 10 US swine veterinarians. These participants were put into small groups that included an international expert to provide their experience and expertise, 1 moderator whose role was to facilitate the conversation and to take notes, and 2 US veterinarians whose role was to engage the expert, ask questions, and really take advantage of the opportunity in whatever way was of most usefulness or interest to them. These small groups discussed a range of topics that were suggested by the National Pork Board Foreign Animal Disease Research Task Force, but they weren't given a rigid structure. They were allowed to talk really fluidly about whatever was of most interest or expertise to them. After about an hour and a half after the main course, we were able to fit in 1 rotation where the US swine veterinarians were able to rotate to a new table and a new international expert. And we designed it so that they would meet with somebody that was a different country from the table they were just at. So that way, trying to diversify potentially the viewpoints and knowledge that they would get to learn from. And then at the end of the evening, we all reconvened together and reviewed the knowledge that we had learned. We expanded on points and clarified some things. and allowed folks to really have that time to talk and get to know each other. This is a list of the 6 main topics that were presented to the group during the workshop, which included traceability of movements, clinical presentation and surveillance, and then 3 biosecurity topics, which were epidemiological separation for swine units, management for feed, wild boar, feral swine, and manure, and management for personnel and vehicles, and finally, disinfection and carcass disposal. So again, they were allowed to talk very fluidly around these topics, depending what was most interesting to them or whatever the experts had the most experience in. But all of the lessons learned from these were captured through those moderator notes during the evening and then produced into a report, which is now available on CAF's website. You can find it at the link here on the right-hand side, or you can go to it through that QR code, and you'll see this on the remaining slides throughout the PowerPoint. So everything that is going to be summarized on the remaining slides is available in full there on that report. For the remaining part of this presentation, I'm going to go through the highlights of the lessons learned and the topics that were discussed during the Vets to Vets workshop. So first off, all of our experts really emphasized that speed and time are critical for an effective ASF response. They said you really need to have a management structure and response protocol in place before an outbreak occurs to have timely decision making. And turnaround time for diagnostic testing is particularly important. In order to enact on-farm strategies, you really need those results within hours and not days. For traceability, it's really difficult to achieve this in many ASF affected countries. A lot of countries are using movement permits to control and monitor commercial movements, often with diagnostic testing requirements that are usually at the cost of the producer. So one example that was described was whole blood that tested via PCR 5 to 7 days pre-movement. Another was monthly slaughter permits that are given through mortality testing. And overall, it was said that movements of small and backyard producers are really difficult to control still across these countries. For clinical presentation in sows, the first sign that was commonly reported is usually reduced feed intake. They say that abortions do follow, but it can take up to 6 months for them to be noticeable above baseline levels, so not necessarily useful as an early indication of ASF. For finishers, they report a range of clinical signs, things from recumbency, sores, sudden death, red skin, poor doing, respiratory problems, skin and joint issues, and bloody nasal discharge upon death. They're also seeing cases of the attenuated disease on their farms, which they report as recumbency and sores in fattening farms. And overall, they say that it's just a lot harder to detect the attenuated disease. For surveillance, some systems have been able to minimize ASF losses in their sow herds from what they report initially being about 10 to 12% to down to a best case of about 5% using stringent observational protocols and some partial depopulation strategies. So this is going to be more relevant in countries where those partial depopulation strategies are allowed. But what they're doing is daily observation of sows for non-specific signs, which they list specifically as off-feed, fever, which they're detecting either through a handheld temperature gun or a mounted barn monitor, recumbency, or just appearing off. And based on a sow exhibiting any of those, they will immediately remove her and her neighbor on either side before even doing diagnostic testing. This is just based on observation alone. They do still take blood for PCR to test it later, but they remove that sow immediately. And then they disinfect underneath her with lime in all of those sows where they were removed. So they say that for best performers with this type of strategy can have losses of about 5 to 6%, worst performers 25 to 30%. But again, for places where partial depopulation is allowed, that's still ideal compared to losing, the majority of your sow herd. Government surveillance has included a range of different methods. For example, 30 whole blood samples taken every 21 days. It was noted that these are collected and submitted by the producer, and there were some questions about quality concerns here. For example, they think that at times they're getting non-porcine samples. Governments are also using slaughter surveillance, 6 months of surveillance in controlled zones, and mandatory submission of tissues from mortalities on a monthly basis. And again, a lot of the veterinarians said that for these programs, the cost can be on the producer to do this testing, to be able to move pigs or ship them to slaughter facilities. And generally, they felt that there is a lot of underreporting of ASF cases. So what veterinarians and producers are doing for their own surveillance of herds, so this is for their own management strategies, is commonly whole blood with PCR done via ear and tail pricks to reduce labor, time, and stress. They're also doing a lot of sampling of the environment, so doing testing via PCR for surfaces, water, trucks, etc. For their grow finish herds, they're commonly using oral fluids where they'll hang ropes for 20 minutes and then test those via PCR. And large companies often have their own laboratory for testing. So that's to decrease that turnaround time for those test results. So they can get them in as little as 3 hours. And some also like to have the ability to take their PCR units and move them around from farm to farm as needed. The next few slides are going to focus on some biosecurity management practices that farms are using. And, not unexpectedly, they are quite intensive and quite stringent. In order to manage those really high biosecurity costs that come with the level needed to manage ASF, a lot of places that are bigger systems will consolidate their pigs onto larger farms. That way, they only have to buy or implement one set of biosecurity equipment and protocols. They're disinfecting everything that comes onto the farm using things like UV light boxes or rooms, ozone or ozone in water, and fumigation. They have practices like 1 needle per pig, cleaning snares between animals where they'll have multiple snares. They might have one that's being disinfected and they can have another so that they can still move quickly through those pigs, but they're making sure that all of their equipment is disinfected between each animal. They also really stressed pest control. One way that they suggested that they use is tunnel ventilation to control airflow instead of having open sides and curtains. And it also just really allows them to generally control the airflow better. They commonly also use fences and barriers, and they prevent people coming on the farm to buy meat directly, which is a practice that is done in some countries. Protocols for pig movement. It was common to use either a lockdown area, a transfer area, or an offsite transfer station. So these lockdown areas were described as being a specific area on or perhaps offsite of the farm where the sale pigs are transferred that gets them away from the main barns or the main premise. So what they'll do is one set of employees will, that's kind of the farm side of the employees, will move the pigs. They'll even sometimes lay down disposable tarps underneath them, like underneath the walkway where they're going to move them. And then they'll walk them down to the transfer area. That is where the buyer or that offsite individual is going to be picking up the pigs, or maybe that's where the truck is that's going to take them off the farm. And then a different set of staff that only works in that area will take over those pigs. It's a one-way flow. They'll a lot of times monitor this using cameras to confirm that no pigs are turning around. And then that new set of staff takes the pigs and they're transferred off the farm. In some countries, because they have such a potential risk for ASF spread through the buyers that will travel from farm to farm buying and moving pigs, instead for their coal sow market specifically, they've set up these transfer stations, which are offsite locations where multiple buyers and sellers visit, but the sellers will come in through one side of the facility. And again, you'll have one-way flow of pigs off the truck, cameras to monitor that. And then the buyers come in through the other side of the facility, and there's no crossover between those two entities. So that's to try to prevent that ASF spread from the buyers to the sellers. Feed treatments and holding times are really commonly being used. For feed treatments, most commonly it was formaldehyde. This is for a couple of reasons. One, because in a lot of places it's much more cost effective in the large quantities that are needed compared to fatty acids. And additionally, they feel that it has a duration of action that will last throughout the transport chain. For feed holding times, there wasn't really a uniform set of protocols that was used between the various experts that were present. Some have holding times before the ingredients make it to the feed mill, others had holding times after, some had a little bit of both, and the duration of that varied from 3 to 30 days. And some even would hold the feed off-site before bringing it onto the farm and feeding it out. Some producers even bought feed mills together and were sourcing ingredients from ASF-free countries so that they would have a bit more control over the supply chain. And really overall throughout countries, swill feeding remains a concern with small farms. And so they really emphasize the need to do things like incinerating airplane waste and really trying to have best practices or not allowing swill feeding where possible. Wild boar and feral swine and manure were not discussed quite as in depth at this workshop, but they did mention that feral pigs have been culled near garbage sites in some places, but really overall, feral pigs and wild boar aren't a uniform risk across different countries because it depends on their density and distribution compared to commercial swine farms. For manure, there really was not a lot of specific protocols mentioned. Some systems said that they don't really perceive it as a high risk. They just expect that fermentation in the manure lagoon will kill ASF, so they don't really have any special procedures there. For water, however, though, they do consider that as a more important risk, especially in places where they're not able to source water from deep wells because the water table is just too high there. So instead, what they will do is treat the water with chlorine before it reaches the pig, and they do conduct weekly PCR testing as well. There's also pretty strict entry protocols and protocols around personnel for farms. So for example, there's usually a required 48 to 72-hour downtime and up to 4 showers required before you can enter the farm. So one system said that, after the first shower, they then require an overnight quarantine, and then they have subsequent showers after that. And they said, we know that scientifically you don't need 4 showers, but the hope is more that by having this longer protocol, it ensures that at least one good shower is taken by that employee. Some showers, they also have even equipped with compliance systems. And so these aren't cameras, but they're sensors that make sure that the employee is in the right position in the shower so that they're under the shower head. And then it automates the water so that they take the correct duration of a shower so that they can't skip out early or kind of avoid the water. It's really trying to standardize that more. There's also various schedules that are used. So one example from the veterinarians that were there was they use 4 days on the farm and then 4 days off. Another system said they actually use up to 30 days on a farm. And for those situations, they have more of a campus style setup where they provide all of the food, dormitories, entertainment, all of that for their employees for that prolonged stay. One system also said they use AI-assisted camera systems to monitor real-time compliance. So these are commercially available camera systems that can be purchased and installed. And this is really meant to replace having somebody there monitoring the cameras to make sure that employees are, doing things like changing their boots or not crossing clean, dirty lines. And the cameras are able to actually see that and send an alert through a smartphone or another device to the farm managers so that they know that that infraction has occurred, and then they can take measures to talk to the employee and manage that biosecurity problem potentially. For food on farms, some systems said we just don't allow outside food at all. Other systems said that we do allow off-farm food, but it just needs to be a non-pork product, and we decontaminate it before it comes on the farm. Trucks are believed to be a major source of ASF spread in various countries. And because of that, pretty much all of these systems make sure that their trucks go through either a wash or truck baker, or sometimes both. For the truck bakers, they use 30 minutes at 70 degrees Celsius, and some even also have GPS tracking to confirm that the trucks actually went to the wash or the bake. Systems that are large enough will also use truck segregation protocols where they use separate trucks for designated purposes. So they'll have trucks for slaughter movements, trucks for internal movements of pigs, trucks for feed, etc. And they don't ever mix those around. A lot just uniformly don't allow feed trucks on their farms, and generally truck traceability remains an issue, especially for small farms where you'll have a truck that can visit multiple farms because they don't produce enough pigs to fill up a single truck. And then when they have ASF positive pigs, they say it's really hard to go back and figure out where that pig came from. For disinfection, common disinfectants include caustic soda and calcium hypochlorite. Lime is also very commonly used as well. They did say really that the choice of disinfectant a lot of times depends more on the availability to get it in large enough quantities rather than having a preference. So sometimes it's really that volume that kind of is making that choice for them. One example of a disinfection protocol after ASF infection that one system uses is first they clean the barn with hot water and soda bicarbonate. And they really stress do not use high pressure hosing because it'll kick up the particulates and just kind of make it harder to clean everything. Then they let the barn sit for 2 weeks, and then they test using environmental samples and PCR. And if it's negative, they will retest 1 week later. If it's still negative, then they release that barn for repopulation. So other systems said that they use longer downtimes, up to 2 months, for their barns after an ASF infection. In part, it depends on regulations for that country and also on financial constraints. So the system that used the shorter downtime said for them, they just can't leave a barn open for 2 months financially. They have to have a quicker turnaround time on that. For disinfection for trucks, some protocols include using ozone and also 70 to 90% alcohol in the cabs. Carcass disposal wasn't discussed in depth during this event, but what was described was the use of on-site composting, which really they said depends on the availability of labor. Sometimes it can be too labor intensive to do that. They also use on-site pits, but really stress that it's important to prevent access by wild or roaming animals. After doing any sort of depopulation, they're always really careful to clean and disinfect that equipment between farms. They give the equipment downtime, and they have a certain section of the farm that's kind of the on and off zone for bringing that equipment in and out. There were some suggestions for euthanasia, which included sodium nitrate with foaming and stunner systems. And generally, they said to avoid using CO2 because it requires just a really large amount for that large number of animals. There were also some interesting producer behaviors that were described by the veterinarians during this workshop. And they really said it's influenced by market prices, indemnity, government and regulation, and also social context within the country. So for example, in a situation where there was no indemnity, they said they really didn't have an incentive for producers to report. And so a lot of producers, in order to prevent losses financially, would just sell their pigs directly into the market whenever they would suspect that they had ASF. Buyers in some of these countries can really influence the market rate of hogs because they take advantage of the ASF situation, and they will offer significantly less than market rate because they know that very quickly those pigs will continue to die off and that these producers are in a really time sensitive situation. This really just makes it even harder to trace and control movements because you've got all of these unregulated movements going on between these sellers and buyers. In another country, they said we only had indemnity for live animals, and they found that producers were using antipyretics and antibiotics to keep the pigs alive long enough so that they could get indemnity for those animals. So there was a lot talked about at the Vets to Vets workshop, but overall there was 3 main conclusions. First, that ASF prevention requires sustained stringent, and really comprehensive biosecurity across all farm elements. And early detection and surveillance is difficult, and it requires daily observation and access to timely diagnostic testing. And overall, to enact these management strategies, speed is key. You need to have a plan and a management structure in place before an outbreak occurs. I would like to thank and acknowledge the National Pork Board, who is the sponsor of this event, for their funding and their support, and also our expert and moderator teams, and our U.S. veterinarian participants for all of their great participation in this first Vets to Vets workshop. Also, a thank you to our CAF staff that helped to organize and run this event, particularly Dr. Sol Perez, who provided a lot of administrative support. I want to thank you for listening to this presentation on the Vets to Vets workshop. At this time, I invite you to complete our short post-presentation survey below. You can access it through that QR code or through the tiny URL, which will take you to a short Google form. There you can suggest ideas for future foreign animal disease topics that you would like to see explored and covered, and also express your interest in attending one of these events. I also have listed my email there and also Dr. Andres Perez's email as well. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. We'd love to hear from you and to be able to clarify any of those points. And finally, again, I invite you to read the full summary. You can find that through the link there in the top right-hand corner or that QR code. Thank you so much for listening.